The shadow of doubt. The morning was crisp and sunlight streamed through the thick branches of maple trees lining Westbrook Avenue. Officer Richard "Rick" Stanton was beginning his shift, driving his patrol car through the calm suburban streets. His mind wandered to his son, Tommy, who he'd just dropped off at school. Tommy had his lunchbox and superhero backpack and had given his dad a toothy grin before joining his friends, reminding Rick of his own childhood, one that now felt like another lifetime. Rick wasn't always a cop. He'd grown up in a small town with a father who worked as a mechanic and a mother who did shifts at the local diner. From an early age, he knew he wanted to protect people, to be someone who stood for justice. But years on the force had hardened him, and the world he once viewed with innocence now looked suspicious and full of threats. He thought he knew how to read people, to see through facades and spot trouble before it started. That was, after all, what made him a good cop. Also, he believed. 20 minutes into his patrol, Rick's gaze settled on two teenage girls walking along the sidewalk. They were dressed in the familiar navy blazers of Westbrook Academy, an elite private school. But something about them seemed out of place. He didn't recognize them, which was odd since he had come to know the faces of many students in the area over the years. And their skin, dark, contrasting sharply with the pristine, white-dominated landscape of Westbrook, stood out. The thought flashed across Rick's mind. Do they really belong here? He decided to pull over, a decision spurred more by instinct than reason. His cruiser rolled to a stop beside them, and he flipped on his lights, the red and blue reflecting off nearby windows. The twins stopped, turning to face him with an air of calm composure that struck Rick as unnatural. Most teenagers would look scared, or at least annoyed, but these girls simply looked neutral. "IDs, please," Rick barked, stepping out of his vehicle. He watched as they exchanged a glance before reaching into their bags to retrieve their identification cards. One of the twins spoke, her voice steady but soft. "We're students here, sir. My name is Amara Thompson, and this is my sister, Aliyah. We're in the senior class." Her calmness unsettled Rick. "We forgot our IDs at home today," Aliyah added, her tone polite but firm. "But our father can confirm." "Your father?" Rick interrupted, his voice laced with skepticism. "Listen, girls, I don't know who you think you're fooling, but I know Westbrook doesn't just accept anyone. You're telling me that you're students here, that you can afford this place." His voice carried an edge he didn't quite recognize, a tone he didn't typically use. The twins stayed silent, their expressions remaining composed despite the rising tension. Rick felt his irritation grow. Their silence, their calm demeanor, only fueled his suspicions. Were they mocking him? Did they think they could fool him so easily? "Get in the car," he ordered. "We're going down to the station to sort this out." He could see the slight tremble in Aliyah's hands as she obeyed, and for a brief second he wondered if he was being too harsh. But he pushed that thought aside. He'd seen too many cases where trust had been misplaced. Better safe than sorry, he told himself as he closed the door on the twins and got back into the driver's seat. As he started the car, Rick glanced in the rearview mirror. The twins sat quietly, their hands folded in their laps, their faces forward. They weren't crying or protesting, which was strange. Instead, they held an air of dignity, as if they knew something he didn't, as if they were waiting. Minutes passed in silence, punctuated only by the sound of the engine. Rick felt the weight of the quiet pressing down on him. Usually, his patrol car felt like his territory, a place where he was in control, but right now, he felt like an intruder. His phone buzzed suddenly, breaking the tense silence. The name on the screen made his heart skip a beat. Captain Edwards. He quickly answered, trying to keep his voice steady. "Stanton here." "Rick, where are you right now?" The captain's voice was sharp, carrying an edge Rick hadn't heard before. "I'm bringing in 2 individuals from Westbrook Academy," Rick replied, hesitating before adding, "suspicious individuals." There was a pause, and then Captain Edwards's voice turned cold. "Those individuals happen to be the daughters of Samuel Thompson, the district attorney. The words hit Rick like a punch to the gut. DA Samuel Thompson. His heart started to race as the implications sank in. Thompson was known across the city as a fierce advocate for justice, a man who didn't tolerate any form of prejudice or bias, a man who could dismantle Rick's career with a single phone call. "Pull over immediately," Edwards ordered. "Release those girls and report directly to Thompson's office. He's expecting you." Rick swallowed, his mouth suddenly dry. "Understood, sir," he replied, his voice barely more than a whisper. He ended the call and pulled the patrol car to the side of the road, his hands shaking as he turned to unlock the back door. The twins stepped out, their faces calm but unreadable. They made no accusations, no hostile comments. They simply looked at him with a steady gaze, a look that carried both disappointment and a hint of pity. It was that look that stung the most, a silent judgment that left Rick feeling exposed. I'm sorry," Rick stammered, feeling the weight of his mistake pressing down on him. But the twins said nothing. They exchanged a brief glance and began walking down the sidewalk, their backs straight, heads held high. As Rick watched them go, he felt a strange sense of shame. He'd seen himself as a protector, as someone who upheld justice. But today he had crossed a line he hadn't even realized was there. The silence of the twins lingered in his mind, their calm, dignified expressions etched into his memory. The drive to DA Thompson's office was a blur, his mind replaying the encounter over and over. Each memory twisted a knife deeper into his conscience. He tried to rationalize his actions, to convince himself that he'd done the right thing, that he'd only been following his instincts. But those excuses rang hollow. When he arrived at the district attorney's office, he felt like a man condemned. The building loomed over him, cold and imposing, and he took a deep breath before walking inside. The receptionist directed him to a waiting room, and he sat in silence, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like an anchor. As he waited, he thought about the twins, about their silence, their composure, and the way they had looked at him. They hadn't needed to shout or make accusations. Their quiet dignity had spoken volumes. It was a lesson, he realized, that went beyond words. And as he sat there, alone and waiting, Rick began to understand that this was just the beginning. He had crossed a line today, a line he could never uncross. But maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to make it right. A reckoning of conscience. Rick Stanton sat outside District Attorney Samuel Thompson's office, his leg bouncing anxiously as he tried to calm his racing heart. The silence of the waiting room felt oppressive, thick with judgment. He couldn't shake the memory of the twins' steady gazes, their silent composure in the face of his accusations. It was the first time in his career that he felt truly out of control, unsure of his own actions, and ashamed of the person he'd become. The door to DA Thompson's office opened, and Captain Edwards stepped out, his face a mask of disappointment. He looked at Rick with an expression that held no sympathy, only hard, unyielding judgment. "They're ready for you, Stanton," he said, his voice low. Rick stood, feeling the weight of his uniform, his badge, and the years he had dedicated to law enforcement pressing down on him. He took a deep breath, braced himself, and walked into the office, feeling like a man on trial. Inside, DA Thompson sat behind an imposing oak desk, his hands folded in front of him. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with silver at his temples, a symbol of authority and wisdom. His eyes, however, were what commanded attention. They were sharp, piercing, and unflinchingly direct. Next to him stood Marcus Williams, Thompson's head of security, a man with an intimidating presence and a reputation for being fiercely loyal to his employer. Rick felt his throat go dry as Thompson gestured to the chair in front of him. "Take a seat, Officer Stanton." Rick nodded and sank into the chair, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, knuckles white as he tried to keep his composure. He could feel Thompson's gaze on him, measuring him, and for the first time, Rick realized that the power dynamics had shifted entirely. In this room, he was not the one in control. He was here to answer for his actions. Thompson's voice was calm, almost too calm, as he began. "Officer Stanton, do you know who I am?" Rick swallowed, nodding. "Yes, sir. You're the district attorney, sir." Thompson leaned back, studying him. "And do you know who Amara and Alia Thompson are?" Rick nodded again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your daughters, sir." I didn't realize." "That much is clear," Thompson interrupted, his tone sharp. "What I don't understand, Officer Stanton, is why you felt the need to detain them. My daughters, dressed in their school uniforms, walking along the street in broad daylight. What was it about them that made you believe they were a threat?" Rick opened his mouth to answer, but the words caught in his throat. He wanted to say it was just a gut feeling, a police instinct. But even as he thought it, he knew it sounded hollow, flimsy in the face of reality. The truth lay uncomfortably close to the surface, but he wasn't ready to admit it, even to himself. Thompson's gaze hardened, his patience thinning. "Let me make this simple for you, Officer Stanton. You detained my daughters for one reason and one reason alone, the color of their skin. You looked at them, saw that they didn't look like the other students at Westbrook, and assumed they didn't belong." Rick's face flushed with shame. He wanted to protest, to defend himself, to say that he wasn't that kind of person. But the truth was undeniable, and the words died in his throat. He had made assumptions, ugly, baseless assumptions, and he couldn't deny it any longer. The DA leaned forward, his voice quiet, but carrying the weight of authority. "My daughters are brilliant, capable young women. They've worked hard to be where they are, in a school that often doesn't see kids who look like them. And then someone like you, a person sworn to protect and serve, makes them feel like criminals in their own community. Do you have any idea what that does to a young person's sense of self-worth?" Rick felt a knot form in his stomach, the gravity of his actions pressing down on him. He hadn't thought about the emotional toll his behavior could have on them. He hadn't thought at all, really. He'd just acted on instinct, an instinct he now saw was flawed, poisoned by biases he hadn't even realized he harbored. I'm so sorry, sir," he managed to say, his voice thick with shame. "I made a terrible mistake." Thompson's expression didn't soften. "A mistake is leaving the stove on, Officer Stanton. A mistake is locking your keys in the car. What you did goes beyond a mistake. It's a failure of character, a betrayal of the badge you wear." Rick's gaze fell to the floor, his face burning. The DA's words hit him harder than he'd expected. He had always believed himself to be a good man, a just man, someone who upheld the law with integrity. But today he saw himself through a different lens, and he didn't like what he saw. Thompson took a deep breath, his tone shifting slightly. "I could have you removed from the force for this. One word from me, and your career is over. But I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm giving you a choice." Rick looked up, surprised. "A choice?" Thompson nodded. "You will be transferred to the 15th Precinct in Riverside. It's a predominantly black community, a place where you'll be forced to confront the prejudices you've clearly carried with you. You'll work there for 6 months, under the mentorship of Officer Thomas King, one of the best officers I know. If after those 6 months, Officer King deems you fit to continue on the force, you'll be allowed to return to your previous assignment." Rick felt a rush of relief, but it was short-lived. Riverside was known for its tight-knit community, a place that didn't easily trust outsiders, especially not white officers with reputations marred by incidents like his. He knew this assignment would be more of a test than anything else, a test of his ability to change. "Thank you, sir," Rick said, his voice barely more than a whisper. I won't let you down." Thompson's expression softened slightly, but there was still a sternness in his gaze. "Don't thank me, Officer Stanton. Prove to me, to my daughters, and to yourself that you can be better. You'll be starting tomorrow. I expect you to approach this assignment with the respect and humility it demands." Rick nodded, feeling both grateful and terrified. As he rose to leave, Thompson's voice stopped him. "One more thing," Thompson said, his tone softer now, almost weary. "I want you to remember this feeling, Officer Stanton. The shame, the regret. Remember it, because that's what my daughters felt when you looked at them with suspicion in your eyes. Don't let them, or anyone else, feel that way again. Rick left the office, his heart heavy, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. He knew he couldn't go back to who he was before. Something had shifted irrevocably. As he walked down the hall, each step echoing off the walls, he felt the weight of his actions pressing down on him. When he got home that evening, his wife Sarah noticed immediately that something was wrong. She set down the pot she was stirring and walked over to him, worry etched into her face. "Rick, what happened? You look different." He sat down at the kitchen table, the events of the day rushing through his mind. He wanted to tell her everything, to unburden himself, but the shame was too fresh, too raw. "I made a mistake today, Sarah," he said quietly, his voice barely a whisper. "A big one." Sarah reached for his hand, her gaze softening. "Do you want to talk about it?" He shook his head. "Not right now. I need some time to think." That night, Rick lay awake, his mind racing with thoughts of Riverside, the new precinct, and the challenges that awaited him. He thought about D.A. Thompson, the calm authority in his voice, the disappointment in his eyes. And he thought about the twins, their dignified silence, their refusal to meet his anger with anger. He had wronged them, wronged their family, and now he had to find a way to make amends. The next morning, he packed his bags, leaving before dawn to make the 3-hour drive to Riverside. As he drove, he replayed Thompson's words in his mind, feeling the sting of each one. He knew this wouldn't be easy. He would be entering a community that had every reason to distrust him, a community that he would have to work hard to win over. When he arrived at the Riverside precinct, he was met by Captain Martinez, a no-nonsense woman with a sharp gaze and a reputation for fairness. She introduced him to Officer Thomas King, his mentor for the next 6 months. King was a tall, imposing man with a quiet strength about him, someone who commanded respect without needing to demand it. King didn't offer his hand. Instead, he simply nodded, his expression unreadable. "We'll be working together, Stanton. I expect you to follow my lead, observe and learn. Riverside is not like the precinct you came from. Here, we serve the community, and that means earning their trust, one step at a time." Rick nodded, feeling a mix of apprehension and determination. This was his chance to prove himself, to show that he could change, that he could be the kind of officer he'd once aspired to be. As they set out on their first patrol together, Rick couldn't shake the feeling that he was at the beginning of a journey he wasn't fully prepared for, but he also knew he had no choice. If he wanted to salvage his career, and more importantly, his own sense of self-worth, he would have to confront the prejudices he kept hidden, the biases he hadn't even been aware of. This was his second chance, a chance he knew he didn't deserve, but one he would seize with all his strength. And as they walked the streets of Riverside, Rick felt, for the first time in years, a glimmer of hope, the weight of distrust. The Riverside precinct was a world apart from the one Rick had known. His old precinct was modern, pristine, equipped with the latest technology and amenities. Here, the building was older, with chipped paint, worn-out floors, and buzzing fluorescent lights that cast a harsh glow over the bustling bullpen. The offices here were different, too. They worked with a quiet efficiency, a kind of resilience that Rick found both admirable and intimidating. These were officers who knew the community intimately, who had built their careers on trust, not authority. And Rick was the outsider, the interloper who'd come to learn some hard lessons. As he walked through the precinct with Officer Thomas King, his assigned mentor, Rick felt the weight of countless eyes on him. Some were curious, some indifferent, but others carried a glint of disdain, a sense that he wasn't welcome here. Word had already spread about why he was here. The incident with D.A. Thompson's daughters had become the talk of the precinct. Rick's reputation had preceded him, and it wasn't a good one. Officer King, tall and broad-shouldered with a calm, unshakable demeanor, led Rick outside to begin their first patrol together. He didn't say much, but his silence spoke volumes. Rick sensed that King was sizing him up, assessing whether this new partner was worth the effort. They started their patrol on foot, walking through Riverside's narrow streets lined with mom and pop stores, small cafes, and murals celebrating Black history and culture. As they passed, Rick noticed how people greeted King with nods and friendly waves, while he received cautious glances or outright stares. A few people crossed the street when they saw him approaching, while others turned away, refusing to acknowledge his presence. "People here don't know you," King said after a while, breaking the silence. "And they're not going to trust you, not at first. You're going to have to earn that trust." Rick nodded, feeling a pang of shame as he remembered how quickly he had judged the Thompson twins. "I understand," he replied, though he wasn't sure he did. Gaining trust in a community he had never really understood would be a much harder task than he anticipated. As they continued walking, they reached a small corner store. The owner, a middle-aged Black man with graying hair and a warm smile, greeted King with familiarity. "Thomas, good to see you, man. How's the family?" "Doing well, Joe," King replied, smiling back. "How's business?" "Can't complain. Got a new shipment of those specialty teas your wife likes," Joe said, gesturing to a shelf behind the counter. He glanced at Rick, his smile fading slightly. "New partner?" King nodded. "Yeah, this is Officer Stanton. He'll be patrolling with me for the next few months." Rick offered a tentative smile, but Joe merely nodded in response, his expression guarded. Rick felt a wave of discomfort, a realization that he was being judged, just as he had judged others. They left the store and continued their patrol, walking past a playground where children laughed and played on brightly colored equipment. A group of mothers sat on benches nearby, chatting and keeping a watchful eye on their kids. As Rick and King approached, the mothers' conversation died down, and they turned to watch the two officers pass. One mother whispered something to another, her gaze fixed on Rick, and they both shook their heads, disapproval evident in their expressions. Rick felt a twinge of anger bubbling up inside him. He wasn't used to being looked at this way, like he was an intruder, an enemy. But he pushed the anger down, reminding himself that this was what he deserved. He was here because he had failed to see people as individuals, and now he was on the other side of that experience. "Why are they looking at me like that?" he asked, unable to keep the frustration out of his voice. King glanced at him, his expression unreadable. "You're a cop in their neighborhood, Stanton, and cops haven't always been kind to this community. They've seen friends, family members, people they love treated unfairly, profiled, harassed. To them, you're just another face in a uniform, another potential threat." "But I'm not," Rick trailed off, realizing how naive his protest sounded. "Intentions don't matter here," King replied, his voice calm but firm. "Actions do. People here don't care about what you think you are. They care about what you do." Rick fell silent, digesting King's words. He was beginning to understand that his badge, his uniform, didn't hold the same meaning here as it did in his old precinct. Here, he wasn't automatically trusted. He was a symbol of a system that had failed these people time and time again. As they rounded the corner, they saw a group of teenagers gathered outside a community center, talking and laughing. When the teens saw Rick, their expressions turned wary. One of them, a tall boy with a serious face, crossed his arms and met Rick's gaze with a defiant stare. King raised a hand in greeting, and the boy's expression softened slightly. "Hey, Mr. King," he said, nodding respectfully. "Who's the new guy?" "This is Officer Stanton," King replied, his tone neutral. "He'll be helping me out for a while." The boy looked Rick up and down, his gaze unflinching. "You the one who messed with the DA's daughters?" Rick felt his face flush. He hadn't expected his reputation to follow him so quickly, especially not among teenagers. He cleared his throat, trying to maintain his composure. "Yeah, that was me. I made a mistake." The boy raised an eyebrow, his expression skeptical. "You saying sorry or something?" Rick hesitated, realizing he didn't know what to say. He looked to King for guidance, but King simply watched, his expression impassive. Yes, Rick finally said, his voice quieter than he intended. I'm sorry for what I did. I judged them without knowing them, and I was wrong. I'm here to learn, to try and be better. The boy regarded him for a moment, then shrugged. We'll see, he said, turning back to his friends. As they walked away, Rick felt a strange mixture of shame and relief. The boy's casual dismissal stung, but it also felt like a small step in the right direction. He had owned up to his mistake, even if it hadn't earned him forgiveness. It was a start. They continued their patrol, and as the day wore on, Rick began to notice the layers of Riverside that he had never seen before. He saw children playing in the streets, their laughter filling the air, and elderly residents sitting on their stoops, watching the world go by. He saw shopkeepers sweeping their storefronts, parents walking their kids home from school, teenagers hanging out at the basketball court. It was a community filled with life, resilience, and a strength that he had never truly appreciated. As the sun began to set, Rick and King made their way back to the precinct. Rick was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. The day had been a whirlwind of emotions, a series of encounters that had forced him to confront his own biases, his own blind spots. He felt like he'd been stripped bare, exposed in a way that made him uncomfortable, but also gave him a strange sense of relief. Back at the precinct, Rick sank into a chair in the break room, closing his eyes and letting out a long breath. He felt drained, but also strangely hopeful. For the first time, he felt like he was on a path towards something meaningful, something real. King joined him, sitting down across the table and studying him with a thoughtful expression. Today was rough, he said, his tone softer than usual. But you did all right. You didn't push back when people were cold to you. You took it in stride. That's the first step. Rick opened his eyes, meeting King's gaze. I didn't realize how much I had to learn. I thought I was a good cop, a fair person. But today, he trailed off, unsure how to put his feelings into words. King nodded, his expression sympathetic. Sometimes we get so used to thinking we're the good guys that we stop questioning ourselves. Being a cop doesn't make you automatically right. It just means you have to work harder to earn people's trust. And trust isn't given freely, especially not here. Rick nodded, feeling the weight of King's words. He thought back to the people they'd met that day, the shopkeeper, the mothers at the playground, the teenagers outside the community center. Each interaction had felt like a test, a challenge to prove that he was worthy of their trust. He knew it would take time, that he couldn't erase years of prejudice with a few words or gestures. But he was willing to try, to take each day as an opportunity to be better. King's voice pulled him out of his thoughts. Tomorrow, we're going to visit the local youth center. Coach Martinez runs a basketball program for the kids after school. It's a good place to start if you want to get to know the community. Show them you're here to help, not just to police. Rick felt a flicker of hope. The idea of spending time with the kids, of showing them that he was more than just a badge, appealed to him. He remembered his own childhood, how he had looked up to the officers in his hometown, how he had wanted to be like them. Maybe, if he could show these kids a different side of himself, he could start to rebuild his reputation, not just in Riverside, but within his own heart. Thanks, King, he said, his voice sincere. I appreciate you giving me a chance, even when no one else here does. King smiled, a rare warmth in his usually stoic expression. I didn't do it for you, Stanton. I did it because this community deserves good cops. If you're willing to put in the work, maybe you can become one of them. Rick felt a surge of determination. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, filled with skepticism, distrust, and moments that would test him. But he was ready. For the first time, he felt like he had a purpose beyond the badge, a chance to make amends, not just for the incident with the Thompson twins, but for all the years he had failed to see people as they were. As he left the precinct that night, the streets of Riverside stretched out before him, bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his commitment settle over him. He had a long way to go, but he was willing to walk every step. This was only the beginning of his journey, a journey he would take one day at a time, one person at a time, until he could finally look himself in the mirror and see the man he had always aspired to be. Bridging the divide. Rick Stanton stood in front of the Riverside Youth Center, feeling a mix of nervousness and anticipation. The building was modest, with brick walls that had weathered years of wear and tear, and a sign that read Riverside Community Youth Center in faded letters above the door. The sound of basketballs bouncing and kids laughing filtered out into the street, and Rick found himself momentarily frozen. This wasn't part of his usual routine as an officer, and he was acutely aware that he would be stepping into an unfamiliar world. "Ready?" came a familiar voice behind him. It was Officer Thomas King, his mentor and guide in this new assignment. King had insisted on accompanying him today, understanding that the road Rick was on was fraught with challenges that would test him in unexpected ways. Rick took a deep breath and nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be." King gave him a small nod of approval. "Just remember, these kids aren't looking for another cop. They're looking for someone who cares, someone who's willing to listen. Don't go in there with a badge, go in there as a person." Rick swallowed, letting those words sink in. It was advice he'd never been given before, and it felt strange to separate himself from his role as a police officer. He was used to being the authority figure, the one who set the rules. But here, he would have to leave his badge at the door, at least in spirit, and try to connect with these kids on their level. As they walked into the youth center, Rick took in his surroundings. The walls were decorated with colorful murals, many of them painted by the kids who frequented the center. They depicted scenes of hope and resilience. A family gathered around a table, a young girl reading a book, a boy holding a basketball with a look of fierce determination on his face. It was clear that this place was a sanctuary for the children of Riverside, a space where they could be themselves, safe from the hardships of the outside world. In the main gym, a group of kids were playing basketball, their laughter and shouts echoing off the high ceilings. Rick spotted Coach Martinez, a short but muscular woman with a no-nonsense expression, overseeing the game with a whistle around her neck. She caught sight of Rick and King and walked over, her gaze assessing. "King," she greeted, nodding to him before turning her attention to Rick. "This must be your new partner." Rick extended his hand, feeling a bit out of place. "Officer Stanton, nice to meet you, Coach." Coach Martinez didn't take his hand right away. Instead, she looked him up and down, her gaze sharp and unapologetic. Finally, she shook his hand, her grip firm. "I heard about you," she said bluntly. "Heard you had a little run-in with the DA's daughters." Rick's face flushed, and he glanced at King, who simply watched, waiting to see how he would handle the situation. "I did," Rick admitted, his voice steady. "And I was wrong. I'm here to make up for that mistake, and I'm here to learn." Coach Martinez raised an eyebrow, seemingly surprised by his honesty. "Well, I don't know about second chances, officer, but I do know that these kids don't trust easily. If you're here to win them over, you've got a long road ahead of you." Rick nodded, feeling the weight of her words. He was beginning to realize just how deep the mistrust ran in Riverside, especially when it came to people in uniform. But he also knew that he couldn't rush this process. Trust wasn't something he could demand. It was something he would have to earn, one small act at a time. As they watched the game, Rick noticed a group of boys off to the side, leaning against the wall and watching the action with folded arms. They looked to be around 15 or 16, old enough to be skeptical of authority, but young enough to still be curious. One of them, a tall, wiry boy with sharp eyes and a quick smile, caught Rick's gaze and held it, a challenge in his stare. King nudged Rick. "Go talk to them," he said quietly. "Let them get to know you." Rick hesitated, but then took a deep breath and walked over to the boys, feeling their eyes on him as he approached. "Hey there," he said, trying to sound casual. "I'm Rick. What's your name?" The boy who had held his gaze smirked, his eyes glinting with mischief. "Name's Jamal. And yeah, we know who you are, Officer Stanton." Rick felt his stomach tighten, but he forced himself to stay calm. Well, it's good to meet you, Jamal. Do you guys play basketball? Jamal shrugged, exchanging a look with his friends. Sometimes. But we're not interested in playing with you, if that's what you're here for. There was a hint of defiance in Jamal's tone, a challenge that Rick recognized all too well. He'd heard that tone before, in the voices of people who had been hurt or disappointed, who had learned not to trust easily. Instead of taking offense, Rick decided to meet Jamal where he was. "That's fair," Rick replied, keeping his voice even. "I wouldn't want to play with me either if I were you." Jamal's smirk faded slightly, replaced by a look of curiosity. "You serious?" Rick nodded. "I'm serious. I know I've got a lot to prove to you guys, and I'm not here to pretend that everything's fine. I made mistakes, and I'm here because I want to make things right." The boys exchanged glances, clearly caught off guard by Rick's admission. He could see the walls they had built around themselves, the defenses they used to protect against disappointment and betrayal. They were just kids, but they carried themselves with a kind of hardness that came from experience. "What kind of mistakes?" another boy asked, crossing his arms and eyeing Rick warily. Rick hesitated, then decided that honesty was the only path forward. "I judge people based on appearances. I didn't take the time to understand them, to see them as individuals. And that was wrong." Jamal's gaze softened, but he didn't let his guard down completely. "So what are you going to do about it?" Rick looked him in the eye, his voice firm. "I'm going to listen. I'm going to try to understand. And I'm going to be here, day after day, doing what I can to earn your trust." The boys were silent, absorbing his words. Finally, Jamal shrugged, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Well, good luck with that, Officer Stanton. You're gonna need it." Rick chuckled, feeling a small sense of victory. It wasn't acceptance, not yet, but it was a step in the right direction. He knew that he couldn't change their minds overnight, but if he could show them that he was willing to put in the effort, maybe, just maybe, they would start to see him as more than just a badge. Over the next few weeks, Rick continued to visit the youth center, showing up for basketball practices, helping Coach Martinez set up for games, and even volunteering to referee a few matches. At first, the kids were distant, watching him with guarded eyes, but gradually he began to break through their defenses. He learned their names, their favorite sports teams, their dreams for the future. He listened as they told him about their struggles, parents working multiple jobs, siblings who had fallen into trouble, dreams that felt just out of reach. Rick realized that these kids faced challenges he had never truly understood, that they were growing up in a world that demanded resilience and strength just to survive. One afternoon, Jamal approached him after practice, his expression thoughtful. "You really mean all that stuff you said about trying to make things right?" Rick looked at him, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "I do, Jamal. I know I've got a long way to go, but I'm not giving up." Jamal nodded slowly, as if weighing Rick's sincerity. After a moment, he held out a basketball. "You play." Rick smiled, taking the ball from him. "I used to, but it's been a while." "Well, let's see if you've still got it," Jamal said, a playful glint in his eyes. He gestured to the court, and soon the two of them were locked in a friendly one-on-one match. Jamal was quick and agile, weaving around Rick with ease, but Rick held his own, surprising both Jamal and himself with a few solid shots. The game ended with Jamal winning by a narrow margin, and as they left the court, Rick felt a strange sense of accomplishment. It wasn't about the game itself, it was about the connection, the sense that he was finally starting to break through the barriers between them. As they walked back into the gym, Coach Martinez gave him a nod of approval, her expression softening. She had watched his efforts over the past weeks, and though she hadn't said much, Rick could sense that she respected the work he was putting in. That evening, as he walked home through the streets of Riverside, Rick felt a shift within himself. He was beginning to see the community in a new light, to understand that these people were more than just faces he passed on the street. They were individuals with stories, with dreams, with struggles that shaped who they were. He thought about his old precinct, about the rigid routines and impersonal encounters that had defined his days. Here, in Riverside, he was learning that being a police officer wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about building relationships, about earning the trust of the people he served. As he turned onto his street, he saw Officer King waiting for him, leaning against his car with a knowing smile. "How was the game?" King asked, his eyes twinkling with amusement. Rick laughed, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. "Not bad. Jamal's got some skills." King nodded, his expression serious. "You're doing good work, Rick. Keep showing up, keep listening. This community might just start seeing you for who you really are." Rick felt a swell of gratitude. King had been his guide through this journey, a steady presence who had believed in him even when he doubted himself. And now, Rick was beginning to believe in himself too. As he stood there, watching the lights of Riverside flicker in the evening dusk, Rick knew that he was finally on the right path. It was a long road, and he still had much to learn, but he was ready to face the challenges ahead. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was part of something greater, a community that had taught him more about humanity, resilience, and strength than he had ever known. And he was determined to earn their trust, one day at a time. Redemption in the fire. It was late afternoon when the call came in. Rick Stanton was finishing up his shift at the Riverside Youth Center, wiping down tables in the main activity room after an art class with the kids. The room was quiet now, filled with the lingering smell of paint and glue. Over the past few weeks, he'd grown accustomed to the rhythm of life at the center, to the laughter of children, the endless games of basketball, and the quiet conversations with Coach Martinez and the other staff. He had begun to feel at home here in a way he hadn't expected. It was a place where he wasn't just an officer. He was a mentor, a friend, and a learner. But that peace was shattered when his radio crackled to life. "Unit 5, respond. We have a reported fire at the community apartment complex on 3rd and Maple. Multiple families inside, possible entrapment. Fire and emergency services en route, but we need immediate assistance with evacuation." Rick's heart leaped into his throat. The community apartments were a familiar landmark, a low-income housing complex filled with families, many of whom he had gotten to know over the past few months. He thought of the children he had seen play in the parking lot, the elderly residents who sat outside in the evenings, and the young parents who greeted him with cautious nods. This was a building filled with lives, stories, and faces he had come to care about. He didn't hesitate. Grabbing his jacket, he bolted out the door, calling to King, who was waiting outside. "Let's go," Rick shouted, urgency sharpening his voice. Without a word, King ran with him, both men sprinting down the street toward the complex. As they approached, they saw a plume of thick, black smoke rising into the sky, the acrid smell of burning wood and plastic filling the air. Residents were already gathering outside, some with blankets over their shoulders, others clutching children or pets. Panic was spreading through the crowd, faces pale with fear, voices overlapping in a chaotic chorus. Rick pushed his way through the crowd, searching for anyone who needed immediate help. A woman with 2 small children stumbled toward him, her face streaked with soot, eyes wide with terror. My mom is still inside. She's on the 3rd floor," she cried, clutching his arm with trembling hands. Rick didn't hesitate. "Stay here," he told her, his voice steady despite the fear gripping his heart. He turned to King. "We need to clear the building. Start with the lower floors. I'll head up to the 3rd. King nodded, his expression grim. "Be careful, Rick, and don't try to be a hero." Rick gave a quick nod, but he was already moving toward the building's entrance, adrenaline coursing through his veins. Inside, the smoke was thick, reducing visibility to just a few feet. He pulled his shirt up over his nose, trying to filter out the worst of it as he navigated through the dim, smoky hallway. The heat was intense, pressing down on him like a weight, but he pushed forward, his mind focused on the mission at hand. Reaching the 3rd floor, he began pounding on doors, shouting for residents to evacuate. Most of the apartments were already empty, but a few people remained inside, either unaware of the danger or too afraid to leave. He helped an elderly man down the hall, his arm around the man's shoulders as they made their way to the stairwell. The man's frail body shook with every step, but Rick kept his grip steady, offering words of encouragement. "Just a little further," he murmured. "You're doing great." When they reached the stairwell, Rick handed the man off to another officer who was escorting residents out. He turned back, determined to keep going until he was certain everyone was out. Then, through the smoke, he heard a faint cry. It was a child's voice, small and terrified. Rick's heart skipped a beat as he turned, straining his ears to locate the sound. He followed the noise down a hallway to an apartment at the far end. The door was slightly ajar, and he pushed it open, stepping into the thick haze inside. "Hello," he called, his voice muffled by the smoke. "Is anyone here?" The child's voice responded, closer this time. "Help, I'm in here." Rick moved toward the sound, finding a young boy huddled in a corner of the living room, his eyes wide with fear, his small body curled into a ball. Rick crouched down, reaching out a hand. "Hey, buddy, it's okay. I'm here to help you. My name is Rick." The boy looked up, his face streaked with tears. "I can't find my mom," he whispered, his voice trembling. Rick felt a surge of protectiveness as he lifted the boy into his arms. "Don't worry. We're going to get you out of here, and we'll find your mom, okay?" The boy nodded, clinging to Rick's neck as he carried him toward the door. The heat was growing unbearable, and Rick could feel his lungs burning with each breath. But he forced himself to stay calm, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. As they made their way down the stairwell, the building shook with the sound of collapsing wood, the fire raging through the floors above. Rick could hear the distant shouts of firefighters, the sirens wailing outside, but his focus remained solely on the boy in his arms. He could feel the child's heartbeat, rapid and frightened, and he tightened his hold, silently promising that he would get him to safety. Finally, they emerged into the fresh air, and Rick carried the boy over to the waiting medics. The boy's mother was already outside, her face filled with relief as she spotted her son. She ran to them, enveloping her child in a hug as she thanked Rick through tears. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Thank you for saving him." Rick simply nodded, too overwhelmed to respond. He looked around, taking in a scene of chaos and devastation. Firefighters were working tirelessly to contain the blaze, hoses spraying water onto the flames that continued to rage, but the damage was severe. People huddled together, some crying, others staring in shock, their homes and belongings lost to the inferno. But amidst the devastation, Rick saw something extraordinary. The community had come together, neighbors helping each other, strangers offering comfort and support. Volunteers were distributing blankets, local businesses had brought food and water, and people were opening their homes to those who had been displaced. It was a testament to the strength and resilience of Riverside, a strength he had only begun to understand. Rick spotted Officer King in the crowd, his face smudged with soot, his expression both exhausted and relieved. King walked over to him, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "You did good, Rick," he said, his voice filled with quiet pride. "You showed them who you really are today." Rick felt a swell of gratitude. For the first time, he felt like he had truly become part of this community. He had faced the fire, both literal and metaphorical, and had come out the other side no longer as an outsider, but as someone who had earned their respect. In the days that followed, Rick continued to assist with the relief efforts, helping families salvage what they could from the wreckage, organizing fundraisers to support those who had lost their homes, and volunteering his time to rebuild what had been destroyed. Each day, he found himself more connected to the people of Riverside, not as an officer enforcing the law, but as a neighbor, a friend, and an ally. One afternoon, as he was helping distribute supplies at a local shelter, he spotted Jamal, the boy from the youth center, watching him with a thoughtful expression. Rick walked over, smiling. "Hey, Jamal. How are you doing?" Jamal shrugged, but there was a hint of respect in his gaze. "I heard what you did, saving that kid from the fire. People are talking about it." Rick nodded, feeling a warmth in his chest. "I just did what anyone would do." Jamal shook his head, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Not just anyone. You didn't have to go in there. But you did." For a moment, they stood in silence, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Jamal extended his hand, and Rick took it, the gesture a symbol of acceptance, a bridge between them that hadn't existed before. "You're all right, Officer Stanton," Jamal said, his tone grudging but sincere. "Maybe you're not like the other cops." Rick chuckled, feeling a sense of pride he hadn't felt in a long time. "Thanks, Jamal. That means a lot." As the weeks turned into months, Rick continued his work in Riverside, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. The community had embraced him, not as an outsider, but as one of their own. He had become a familiar face at the youth center, a trusted presence on the streets, and a friend to those who had once looked at him with suspicion. And through it all, he had learned a powerful lesson. Being a police officer wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about serving people, understanding their struggles, and standing beside them in times of need. It was about earning trust, one day at a time, and honoring that trust with every action, every word, every choice. One evening, as he sat on the steps of the youth center, watching the sunset over the rooftops of Riverside, Rick felt a deep sense of peace. He had come to this place as a man weighed down by prejudice and fear, but he was leaving as someone who had been transformed by the resilience, kindness, and strength of the people he had come to know. In the end, it wasn't just Riverside that had changed, it was him, and he knew that he would carry the lessons he had learned here with him, wherever his path might lead. For Rick Stanton, this was just the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter built on compassion, understanding, and the unwavering belief that, no matter where we come from, we are all part of the same community, bound by the desire for justice, respect, and hope. And as he looked out over Riverside, he knew that he had finally found his place, not just as an officer, but as a man who had learned to see the world through different eyes.